So what I think is funny about that is that you've I've been working as your editor for 5 years, I guess, a little over five
Yeah.
years now,
When
in
you saved
various.
me from that Pakistani English gang.
Right, right, the one that was going to stab you with 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 1,000 sirs. Um, but the thing that I've noticed is funny is that as we progress down this road, because at first, the first time you hired me, it was just to make something a little bit more readable,
Hmm.
and we'll leave it at that. And the rest, as time went on, it became less about that because your writing got so much stronger, and it became just as much about structure and strategy, both for the nonfiction and the fiction books. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, and why that has been a good, not just a good working relationship for me, but it's also really helped in my own writing, talking through things with you, because then, even though we're talking about your stuff, because it's on I'm on the clock for you,
Hmm.
I start thinking about things, and I realize that, shit, I need to be taking my own advice. Or, you know, I need to be applying those same suggestions to what I've been working on. So what I want to talk about today is sort of that nature of collaboration in story editing and story development, and what story development really is, or developmental editing really is, however, whatever labels anybody uses, and kind of get past the idea that everybody has that editing is simply fixing commas and shit.
Which
And
is funny. Yeah, you're right. As we go on, it becomes less and less important. Like I've given up on knowing where a semicolon goes. I really have.
well, and like, it doesn't really matter. That you quoted me yesterday, I think, on the whole thing about, you can do whatever you can do whatever you want, as long as you can execute it well for the reader.
Yeah.
And grammar and punctuation and shit like that is really operates that way. English, a lot of English, other individuals don't want it to. But the truth of the matter is that if I go through and I read any of the most popular people that are online, whether it's Delicious Tacos or Worst Boyfriend Ever, or a lot of these other guys, in some cases their grammar is total shit, but it doesn't really matter, because A, they're still able to communicate their ideas clearly, and B, nobody else's grammar is any good anyway. So how does anybody know if they're reading something that, people are used to reading things that are kind of start and stop and jumbled, and they're having to figure shit out, and that's not ideal, and that's not what you want, I don't think, as a writer who's trying to put out a good product. But that's the reality. And I even read newspaper articles online and stuff where the grammar and everything else is just shit, but nobody cares. So I mean, there's that part of it. And the other part of it is that if the story's good enough and you're able to tell it at least well enough, most people out there don't care about grammar. And since the literary establishment has been pretty well demolished due to Amazon and other print on demand services, there's no gatekeeper anymore. So you don't have to, and this is not necessarily a great thing, because I think there have been some negative developments as a part of it, but you don't have to appease the literary establishment anymore. You just have to appease your audience. And that's really what an author is there to do, is to please the audience. So if the audience is pleased, who cares if your commas are in the wrong place, on the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as the serious one between the two of us here right now, I don't want to sound pedantic, kill your very lighthearted vibe here. Didn't Shakespeare invent like 400 words in his plays? And he had them in like pubs
Probably.
and bars. It was very lowbrow.
Oh yeah.
And he was like, and that's
I
like old
mean,
English.
you're
He's like, I need a new word here, so I'm just going to invent wopty splat. He did the Willy Wonka thing. And now everybody is like sitting in Oxford going, well, when he was talking about farting, this is what he meant. It's like,
he's talking
language
about farting.
evolves as long as it's readable. I can't remember what it was. I remember, was it you saying this? Or was it me thinking this? But it was like always thinking about the end reader, like who's reading this.
Right.
Because I don't think anybody thinks about that. I really don't. And I'm pretty sure you put it into my head, or I probably wouldn't have thought about it either. When the person's sitting down and they're reading this, what are you expecting from them? And I noticed as I'm starting to try and read more people's fiction is that most of the time what people want you to notice is how smart they are, or how I'm a fancy writer now. My Miller Lite shirt is fancy cotton polyester blends.
Well, what people
cares.
Well, I mean, this is the one problem with not having an education, because if you go back in time far enough, being a writer, particularly in like 17th, 18th, 19th century England, I mean, that might win you some patronage amongst the, landed aristocracy or whatnot, but it was considered to be a frivolous, almost feminine way to make a living. And even right up through the 19th century and the earlier 20th century, I mean, everybody who was a writer was just a lazy money grubber, which is really what everybody still is, because we don't want to dig ditches. We want to, pound on the keyboard for a few minutes and get paid for it. And we think that's
never want to dig ditches again. Let's make
that
clear.
Yeah, I don't either,
yeah.
Especially not at my advanced age. But it's like that was always considered to be a very lowbrow, feminized way of making a living. Whether you were a journalist or anything else, you were just kind of considered not quite a bottom feeder, but not far from it. And a lot of writers did become that.
Yeah, well, is that why Twain was dropping so many N-bombs and Hemingway had a gun and whiskey and Thompson was shooting a typewriter? Like, were they overcompensating?
I don't think so. I think they're just, well, let's face it.
The cynic in me would love if that was the case. Feminine art, I'll teach you a lesson.
Well, I don't know if it was overcompensating so much. I think that's, I mean, I grew up hunting and fishing, and I write about that a lot, which, much to your dismay, but I don't lead with it. It's not a skin suit for me. But let's think about it. And this really goes into the heart of what I wanted to talk about today. Back in the day, you could be a writer. As we approached the end of the first third of the 20th century, that's when we started really seeing rock star writers like Hemingway and everybody else. Mm-hmm. And why was that? It was because there was an economic infrastructure in place for a lot of other people to profit off of their backs, off of their work. So, the real bottom feeders, in my opinion, are the publishers and the literary critics and the newspapers, because they're the ones who they needed Hemingway, so it was to their advantage to, make him a rock star, to boost his image, make him like the Jimi Hendrix of writers, back in the day, or, F. Scott Fitzgerald or any of these other people, because they provided a good living for a whole lot of other people who were, adjuncts to their writing activities. Right. So these days we don't have that quite as much.
Yeah. Well, there was an article somebody had written. They used to be Trad Pub and they'd switched over, and they were talking about just breaking down what you do when you get onto a traditional publisher's bucket list. And I was like, what is it what does this relationship get you? Like, first, prestige. Does that matter? I've never been to a party where somebody's like, a penguin? Oh, excuse me. They give you an advance, but it's paid against royalties. So if you write a crappy book and are picked up, your advance covers the cost of what you're not going to sell plus. So, I mean, I guess there's a little cash there.
Right.
But they don't market. You have to do your own marketing. They'll edit for you. They'll do your cover, which, again, you've seen it yourself. It's not hard to find. Well, it's hard to find good people, but you can find your own people to do it. They don't even do Amazon sale. Like, if you want to put your thing for sale on Amazon, you have to cover those costs yourself. Mm-hmm. And I realized, so if you do all the work, we'll stamp our logo on it. And you could be fancy at dinner parties. And I was like, who would take this deal?
Right.
And I have a feeling the only reason the old guys took the deal is because that was it. Printing presses were expensive, and nobody knew how the heck to work a 4-point lithograph,
Well, also back in the day, if you could write decently and you were an English professor somewhere, and you wrote a novel that was well received by the critics anyway, and jump through whatever other hoops you had to jump through, you'd get, you could probably get tenure or an endowed chair or something like
Really?
that. A lot more, a lot more chicks would fuck you, that kind of stuff. So there were fringe benefits to it. No, you didn't pay for a drink the rest of your life if you were in a college town bar, but
Professor
it was
Stephen
kind of
King,
like
can I
that.
see you after class?
That's right. It's like that.
I'll bring the Coke.
And so, and so it was like that, and I think between that and people who were just novelists and didn't want to be a part of academia, and who can blame them, it was just it was a totally different economic system, or I guess subsystem of the bigger economic system, because back when all of the distribution and communications and everything else could all be integrated, you had writers had publicists and agents, and the publishing house had editors, not just editors, but also copy editors. So the copy editor would go through after the editor and the author worked on the story, and then it's the lower level underling who was just hired, who has to go in there and fix grammar and commas and bullshit, and then God forbid he runs into a temperamental writer who yells at him for changing anything. And then you have there's all kinds of, crazy crap that goes on when that kind of system was in place. But that's really been wiped off the map with self-publishing and independent publishing. So now you have to, now, even though technically the writer was always in charge, the writer would hand the manuscript.
Well, the writer had one job.
They had one job. He had to write it. And, depending on who the writer was, he'd either hand in something that the publishing house thought was pristine, according to the senior editor, or it would be a fucking mess. And they would have a team of editors who would go through and stitch the thing into something legible. And
I heard a rumor about that. I heard Stephen King was like that, but he kept giving them manuscripts every 3 months. Yeah. But his editor was like the true hero behind the scenes that made them legible. I have no idea if it's true. I want to believe, though.
I haven't heard about him. I've heard about other people, and I've known a few people back when I was in still teaching, and we're talking, the 90s, early 90s.
Okay, Unc.
Yeah, Uncle Misogyny. The few writers who actually published through a publishing house and had books that did reasonably well, but weren't ever, they were never rock stars. And there were a lot of them. Because I remember when I was at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, that's where I got my master's from. And I was finishing up there, and my faculty advisor, he'd been writing a novel for 30 years. Right. So I don't think he ever finished one, but he had a lot of friends who had published, and there was this one guy who had written a couple of really good sort of comic detective novels, and he was there at UAB begging for a job, because he had made about all the money he was going to make on the 2 novels he published on their first run. I don't think they got picked up for a third. I mean, they made it to mass market paperback. It was hardback, and then it went to mass market paperback, and then nobody picked it up again. So he needed a job. So he was there just trying to get a job teaching freshman comm, just like I was as a graduate student. And I got to talk to him for a while, which really disheartened me about my dreams of becoming a writer. But anyway, I digress. But that was sort of the situation there. And now it's like, to get back on topic, the writer is now, not the guy that hands over the manuscript. The writer is the guy who's essentially the CEO of his manuscript and has to decide, okay, what am I good at? What am I not good at? Who do I need to hire to take up my slack so that I can focus on the things that I'm good at? Which is why I wanted to talk about story development and story editing today, is because I think that's the one thing that's most universally applicable to almost anybody who writes, because the days of people being considered rock star writers en masse are over. And so you're not a delicate genius producing this ultimate work of art anymore. You're somebody
You're a
who's
brand.
producing. You're somebody who's you're well. I mean, to go back to my usual metaphor, you're building a chair, and you want to build a good chair. And if people can sit in it over the years and it not fall apart on them when they sit down on it, then you built a good chair, and you can build more. And that's really what you're doing as a writer these days, really all the time. Because if you think about how many books have been published and how many people have made a living off of those books between the writers and the publishing teams and everything else, most of them we've never heard their names and we'll never know their names. But they sold a lot of books because they were, because housewives were reading them during the day, or their husbands were reading them on the train going into the city to their job, as an ad man, and all that good stuff. And so there are all kinds of people like that who nobody's ever going to know who they were, but they made decent livings off of their writing because they were able to connect with their audience. And those are the people that I try to emulate. And when you and I talk about stuff, that's already where your mind was. And then when we start working on stories together, that's kind of what I've always got in the back of my mind is like, let's put out a book, let's put out a story that a lot of different people would want to read if they were sitting on a train having to go in and out of the city every day, right? And
well, it's more than that.
So I wanted to kind of pick up. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say it's more than that too, because I know. So my old lady, she's one of those stubborn types where if she reads a book and she hates it, she has to finish it because she hates wasting food. And I thought about this, like, picture yourself being that writer that somebody else grabbed it because you did it's a nice cover, and then they're reading it and they hate you every second of it. I can't be that guy. The skate, the guy who gets by just on the front end of value, or
right.
Because I think it's my best compliment that I've ever heard on this one is like, dude, I finished this in like an afternoon. Yeah. And I used to get offended because I'm like, dude, I worked for months on that. You finished it in like 4 hours? But then I thought about it and I'm like, dude, that's an extremely good compliment. It means, A, absolutely, at no point did the book take him out of it. B, at no point was, like, even the little decisions, the typography and that, at no point did it tire him to the point where he has to stop and take a break. 3,
right,
it flowed. He's almost, I don't know if people do this. Like when I read, if I'm really into it, I will kind of like picture it in my head as if it's playing out, almost like not quite a movie, but more like you're there.
Scenes. Yeah.
Yeah. But is that visually? It's like I can actually picture the apple. So
yeah,
I always
do
just
that.
thought, oh, good. Yeah, great storytelling, I think, does that. At least I hope it does that, and I aspire to have it do that. I always got a preface thing because I don't know anything. Like I was raised on the Hardy Boys and hooked on phonics. So it's no masters of fine arts or whatever, but I just know what I like, and I know what I don't like. And what I don't know I don't like, I'm learning quick. Because God knows Substack is sending me everything. Here, man, here's a whole bunch of stuff you won't like. I'm like, keep it coming, coach.
Well, that's kind of like what one of the things I wanted to touch on, because you're right. There is no better compliment than, oh man, I got through your book in 4 hours. And your books are not 4-hour books. Technically, they're a little bit, if they're 50, 60,000 words, most people aren't reading that fast. But the fact that you work so long and hard on the story itself, as well as complementary things to being able to read fast, like typography and stuff, which does make a difference. That's really a testament to the age-old formula of what works. Fortunately, you're multi-talented enough that you can write a story, but you can also do typography and graphic design, that you can handle a lot of the in-house work yourself, and you don't have to farm it out. And it pleases me when people say stuff like that about your work, because you always come up with a good idea for a story, and then I think about how many times now, working on fiction in particular, that I started noticing that we start working on it a lot earlier than you used to bring me in. Like on the nonfiction books, sometimes we'd have a strategy meeting, but not often. We would just talk
Yeah.
after the first, I start doing the first edit. And then by the time we got to, I guess, later books, we started with conceptualizing things like the scoreboard and frame and stuff like that. So that by the time we got to your fiction, we had like, I think you got me for 2 strategy sessions with Dogwalker before you finished the manuscript, right? Seems like we did 2.
Yeah, there was one when it
And
was a third of the way. Second one was after the first draft, and then third one was after the revisions. And then I didn't need to do a third draft for that, which was nice.
do you
Usually have
remember
to
what we
write
talked
things 3
about?
whole times.
Do you remember what we talked about when we did those sessions?
For some of them, well, first off, there was like about an hour and a half worth of meetings where I yelled at you for complimenting me. I remember that specifically.
Yeah.
Oh, I was trying to get him to
That's when I
spit that
started
out.
day drinking.
Yeah, that's what I said.
That's
A lot of it was,
that's an old joke.
yeah, the big focuses from what I remember were on each one of the characters, like for the Rex one, to pace his character arc better. Because there was a
Right.
couple things there where it was kind of sluggish and they were just kind of doing the same thing. You had brought to my attention, I had like a thread that went through it of like the symbols, the watch, the Xbox, the sofa, the sheets. And I didn't really think much of those, but you draw it to my attention like this is actually something that connects because it's almost like 15 short stories kind of connected by this loose thread of symbols.
Hmm.
And so by focusing on those, you're going to allow it to have a structure and not just be an anthology. But it was always little stuff like that, which is why I can remember those 2 examples, but there were so many more. Because it's like dressing. It's always in the details.
Well, it's like I think that's one of the things that makes for a good story anyway, is that, and we talked about that at the time, is about, if you make things just clear enough so that, it's kind of like hanging there like a piñata. If you want to, you can go and smack it and get some candy out, but the party isn't necessarily ruined because you didn't. And so it's like you can read it just purely as a story, but if you start noticing those kinds of things that you drop in there, people criticize those kinds of literary devices and things sometimes for being either extraneous
Pedantic.
or well, not, I don't know about pedantic, but more like you're just, you're playing a game with the reader. You're just dropping clues and then you're going to make fun of somebody who doesn't actually get the joke, right? But what those things really do for me, and why I like for us to work on them when we're working on one of your novels, one of your manuscripts, is because I think they tie the story together better. They make the story feel tighter, even if the reader isn't entirely aware of it, because those things end up being repeated throughout. And just like with comedians and we talked about this, just like comedians who use callbacks at the end of the show, and then they call back to a joke at the beginning, but they've also tied part of the premise or part of the punchline to something at the end. It gives you a feeling that this is very tight and complete and kind of perfect in the sense that it's complete. And I think those things do that for novels and short stories very well, which is why I like to focus on them. And I think they help.
Which is great advice, by the way. It's one of the best things you've added to my skill set, I guess is the word for it. I don't know.
Well,
I was worried too.
yeah,
I think one of the other sessions we had where I was worried about doing it, and I'm like, is this too on the nose? Because when you're writing it, it always seems like you're treating him like a 4-year-old, that you have to over-explain it. And you're like, no, when it's not in your head, it's not as so it's not as obvious as you think.
Right.
That's something else that I wouldn't have even thought about had you not been there. It's like how, like I always thought about it as how much do I want to respect the audience, but the way it was executed was making it more convoluted, so it was harder for the audience to get it. Right. You kind of got that shit out of my head, thank God.
Well, and the reason I think that's good is because I think that and this is something nobody ever talks about, but having symbols in there throughout a story or a novel, they provide this kind of intuitive structure that I think people pick up on. But the thing they do for the reader is they help the reader. I mean, not the reader, the writer. I think they help the writer focus during the process of either writing or, revising the manuscript or rewriting it or whatever. I think it helps clarify for you what's going on in that chapter, or so if you understand what the significance of the watch is, or the duvet cover or whatever, it helps you focus the both the physical action and the emotional action that's going on in that chapter or in that section, in that part, on what is represented by, say, the duvet cover. So instead of just having a lot of random actions that happen for no apparent reason at all, it helps you write a more unified story, even if the reader is never really even privy to that process. And so I think it always ends up benefiting the reader anyway. And that's why I think those things are good, is because it helps keep the writer focused.
It's like there's a skeleton or rebar, I guess, maybe a way to put it. I'm not even sure what the proper one is. But to be fair, another part for me, another thing that I enjoyed about it is seeing it executed poorly in other books. I use the concept of mental stack, which is like a video game concept, but I don't know if I've talked to you about that. And you kind of explain it in different words, but that's kind of the way I've been able to internalize it is. So for all these symbols and all the details, like who looks like this, who looks like that, everything you describe, they end up in my head and they just kind of stack up, because anytime the writer's telling me something, he has to specifically put it there. So I assume it's there for a reason. And if it's there for a reason, that means there's got to be something later on that needs it to be that way. Like, why is his hair blonde? I don't know, but it's going to come up in chapter 3. And what I find, especially with guys who go overly verbose with detail, but the details have no symbolism attached to them, is now I have a head full of stuff, and I know there's going to be a test later, and I'm not reading what I'm seeing in front of me.
Yeah.
And then I get to and I've noticed this. It was like those books, I'd get to the end of the chapter, I'm like, what the fuck did I just read? And I have to go back and read it. And then I've gotten through one, and I've just learned not to even try to get through them anymore. And I realized like most of that stuff doesn't even pay off. Like, it really didn't matter what color the laser gun was. It did not matter what the orc's amulet, like any of those little superfluous details, they didn't matter. And so the best way for me to read them would have been just to skip details. But then I'm like, why am I buying a book if I'm skipping past paragraphs of text or pages or chapters? Like, what's my job here? Is my job just to buy the book and then sit there, clap like a seal as you read a movie to me?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, look at it in economic terms. You've paid so much per word, so you should be able to read every word, and it should be relevant, right?
Which is wonderful for a commodity, and writing's a commodity now. Let's face it. Like you said yourself, there's 3 million published titles this year. With AI, it's probably going to be even more. It's a commodity.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't want to just buy a bushel of soya beans and sit there chewing on them for the next 4 hours. I kind of wouldn't mind you put a little salt on them, a little soy sauce, dress it up nice on the plate. I don't know what this metaphor translates to in writing, but it sounds good, and I'm smiling when I say it. See, it's the execution.
Well, look at it. Yeah, look at it in terms of something you always do, which is about not wasting the reader's time, which I think is something that most people who write don't take seriously enough at all. And I know I'm always thinking about that, when I'm writing my stuff for the, 5.5 people who actually like it. But God bless those 5.5 people. But I guess my point is that, I read this book once by this guy, and everybody was praising how great it was. And he was manosphere or manosphere adjacent. It was a fiction book. It was a novel.
Off chance, did this guy murder 6 people and die by cop?
He did not. This is not that.
Oh, different. Got it. I had to ask.
This is not the person who wrote the book that will be studied in English departments one day. this is somebody much more minor whose primary occupation was not fiction writer, but I guess he figured, what the hell, I can spell. So he wrote this book, and in the opening scene, there's this. The opening scene is just this guy sitting at a desk, and he picks up a burrito, and I think he described it as a waterfall of grease flowed out of the burrito all over the guy's shirt or something. And then somebody came in to talk to him, and it was just a bunch of like shit like that would just little things that happened, but nothing. It didn't set up anything in the next scene. It was just like, oh, well, here's, I think this is funny, so I'm going to put this here. And then I think this is funny, so I'm going to put this here. And it was kind of like stacked like that. So by the time I got to about the third or fourth page, I just quit. And I'm not like your wife. I just throw that shit away when I'm done with it, or I give it away to the used bookstore. But, to waste somebody else's time. I kind of feel like I should burn those books, though. I'm against burning books in general, but the ones that I think are just, not that they're evil or immoral, they're just wasting people's time. I do kind of feel like I should burn those, but just out of principle.
Well, I mean, and that's
just out of general
that's the good
principle,
thing.
because I'm
Yeah, for sure. But talking to you, that's the good thing about it, because I like to think I know what I'm doing. I mean, I don't, but I like to think I do. And I have my structure and my outline and the way I write and my voice and this. And in my head, it all makes sense because I don't know the things I don't know. You have, on the other hand, you're an educated man. You know books. I think your sales pitch, which is a great one. I've read more books than just about anybody you've known.
Well, that's not necessarily bragging. Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't take it as a brag. I take it as in an expertise. It's like, I've done 17 heart surgeries. Done. Sold. Did anybody die? No. All right. Not bragging, but it's true.
Yeah,
so
it's like,
you'll bring up things that I wouldn't have considered. And because you're from a different generation, you bring it up in ways that I wouldn't phrase it. And it forces me to not think in jargon or in like pop culture references or anything like that. I actually have to think about it because I got to translate from Gen X, who was raised with a radio in his car, and translate it into millennial, who hates Harry Potter. And just that act, it takes me out of whatever, I'm sounding pedantic here, or whatever the word is, where everybody's so busy and you're focused in your lane, you got your flow state, and you take you out of that to actually like think nuts and bolts.
Right.
And it's amazing to kind of, and even when you're not specifically advising me on something that's good or something that maybe need to be removed, it forces me as I'm writing things to think about how is Nick gonna talk about this, and see if I can head that off at the pass. You know what I mean?
Kinda.
I don't even mean this as I'm like scared of you yelling at me. I just mean like teaching me how to think, not showing me what to think about the work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the point I was getting to, which I think you've explained pretty well, even though you didn't put this particular point on it, is that when you start throwing in random shit just because you want to get 10 more words down before you quit or something. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of value, and I've come to do this in my own writing, is that, I'll write out as far as I think it needs to go. But then when I realize I'm starting to force shit, I just stop right there. And sometimes I'll put, a placeholder name or a placeholder word or something like that in there, like this, there's a new character. I don't know what to call him, so I'll call him James for now. And then the next day when I come back, I'll have a completely new idea of who that character is and what his name should be and everything else. But the point is that when you get to the point where you're just throwing in shit just to have shit in there, then the whole thing ends up becoming disjointed, and you're wasting words. You're wasting, every one of the, you have so many, a 60,000 word novel, that sounds like a lot, but it's not really that many words when it comes to actually telling a story that is both engaging and entertaining and, worth your time. And so when you throw in throwaway scenes like that, burrito waterfall, which is what I call it in my mind now, or the grease waterfall. That's just one opportunity you've lost to get the reader into whatever your story is, or to set up something that's going to pay off down the road and be really interesting. So to me, it's just kind of an insult to the reader when you don't take that kind of stuff seriously. And that's why I think that's one of the reasons why I've always liked working with you, even, you know, even when we started on the nonfiction, and really even when I first became acquainted with you doing, you know, when you were on video, on live streams and podcasts and stuff, is because when people would ask you questions, even if it was the same question that 100 people have already asked you before, but there was a little something different about it, even if you were just faking, you gave the impression that you were giving some actual thought to it, and wanted to make sure you understood what they were asking and give them a reasonable answer, even if the reasonable answer was, yeah, you're fucked. But you still seem to consider that and not just blow people off with a stock answer that I see a lot of people do when they do those kinds of things, and probably which I do when I do that shit too, even though I don't do that shit. So I think you've always been thoughtful about that, and I think that's paid off in particular since you went into writing fiction, because you really have to think long and hard about a lot of shit. And when you combine that with what we've talked about before, which is if you're already a good storyteller, then that's half the battle, because a lot of people who want to write novels are not good storytellers. They haven't told that many stories before. So they're starting at absolute zero, and they don't realize how far they need to go to get to where they need to be to actually tell a good story that isn't boring. And I'm not going to call anybody out, but there are a lot of people I read online who are popular writers, and they just bore me to tears. I don't see how anybody gets through their shit, because it's just always the same thing over and over again. And it gets to the point where you realize that a lot of stuff, whether it's music or whether it's movies or video games or books, they end up being, you know, it's a blank screen for the readers or the audience's own narcissism. You know, they just want to use that, you know, to project their own skin suit, you know, life or character or whatever on there. And they're not really looking to be engaged by something. They just want to, you know, they just want to see themselves, or perhaps escape into something that they could never do or would never do. And
but I always
don't
have
have a
such
problem with
low
that.
imaginations with that, though, because I know the type you're talking about.
Right.
And it's always like,
Well,
dude, you can do anything.
It's like, how many times you want to read the Hardy Boys, right? I mean, the Hardy Boys were great when I was 6. You know, I started reading Hardy Boys, I think, when I was 6. I started getting Hardy Boys books as Christmas presents and birthday presents and shit from people who I thought hated me because I wasn't getting, you know, tanks and G.I. Joes and shit from them. But, you know, I loved reading those Hardy Boys books when I was young, and Doc Savage and stuff like that. And actually, I still like Doc Savage. But as I got older, you know, there was my interest got a little bit more, I don't want to sound highbrow about it, but I just wanted something more interesting and complicated, I guess. And that's where it gets to be a little bit more difficult, because, you know, life can be complicated, or at the very least complex. So when you're reading a story, you know, at some point you want to get beyond the Hardy Boys, because most adults don't read Hardy Boys anymore. They, you know, they're going to read something different. Even if I don't like it, even if I think it's crap, it's still going to be at an adult level, more or less. So there's that.
Well, that's what lit RPG. I think I finally understand it. I was asking if you guys. I don't know if you guys know about the genre. Whoever's in the audience, guys are writing like a tabletop D&D session as if it's a let's play game. There's this one guy I followed. His name's George Solidus or whatever. He brags about AI writing lit RPG, and I look at the sales figures they sell. So I'm confused. I'm like, how does this work? And everybody that I know who's an author is like, throw him into the volcano. And so I check it. I actually read a sample, and it's like you were saying at the Hardy Boys. It's people did things happened. The motivations are clear. Oh, that's a job. I got to do my job because that's what people do. And there's like nothing sophisticated about it at all, which I guess works. I don't want that audience. I couldn't sell a book that I wouldn't want to read myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I realize, there's those layered approaches, which is kind of the stuff that you always bring up with me, because I'll try to execute on it. I'll explain what I'm trying to do, and you always let me know if there's a gap between what I have in my head and what's on the page, which thank God. Because there's been I don't know how many times where it's like a little thing. It's in my little margins, just WUT. Sometimes you don't even bother with question mark. You're like, I think he understands enough.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think the thing is that it's so. I mean, I even do this in my personal life if I'm communicating with somebody by text.
Yeah.
Like I can send a text to somebody, and depending on who that person is, they'll either get it or they won't, based on either our experience together or being, like there are texts I can send to my friends that I've had since high school, and it'll be some kind of weird inside joke or something, and they'll immediately get it. And then I could send the same thing to somebody else I met a month ago, and they could take it either as, he's having a mini stroke, or he's insulting me, or something else. And because it's the natural way I communicate, sometimes I let it slip before I realize that I'm essentially writing to myself without considering who the audience is. And I think that's one of the big things an editor does in terms of story development and story editing, is that even though it's not technically directly a part of the story itself, it's still reflecting back to the writer. This is how this comes across to me, either in terms of meaning or tonality or whatever. Is that how you really want to do that? And does that really support what's going on in the story at this point? And I think it's really valuable to have somebody who can do that. It doesn't have to be a paid editor. It can be if you have a friend or a writer friend and you swap manuscripts and give each other notes and stuff, it can be that. But it's really helpful to have that, because that way, at the end of the day, you really don't want the writer talking to himself. You want him talking to whoever his audience happens to be. And that's something that can be really difficult for one person working alone and then putting it out there alone to
and
to
not
accomplish.
always bad stuff either. Because sometimes you've had that where I think it was in Softbone, where I meant something, but you took it as a different meaning, but I liked your meaning better. And so I just kind of rolled with that. So in that kind of sense, it's helpful. Death of the author kind of thing.
It's nice to have that, and to be honest, a lot of times when I'm working on my own stories and my novel and stuff, I think about conversations we've had about yours, and it makes me look at things in a different way. And I think that's pretty cool. And the other thing about that is well, shit, I went off on that tangent, so I forgot about what the other thing was. But
that's fine. But I will say, I think you need the money. Like, as much as you said a friend could read it with you, I don't think that works. I find that everybody who I like I'm on friendly terms with, they want to be supportive. They don't want to burn bridges if they tell me my manuscript's a piece of shit. So they don't say that.
Well, and I mean,
you kind of have to believe it, but with money, then it's like, and granted, you're good in the sense that you've clearly worked corporate before, so you know how to do like the compliment sandwich or any of the other ways you're supposed to talk as a consultant to somebody when their idea is shit without saying it. So I mean, I think we're at a point now where we don't have to do that anymore, but at the beginning, that's what it was like.
Yeah, now I just say I think this is just bad.
Yeah. But if I was like, most people are fragile, so you were good at couching the language in a way the other person can understand it without putting that wall up and feeling threatened, right?
Oh, yeah,
I don't think until you pay somebody to do that, I don't think they're able to do that. Unless it's somebody that hates you, but then they're just looking for reasons to shit on you, which isn't helpful either.
Well, I was looking at it more as like, let's say Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald were having, they went fishing one weekend and they were having drinks, and one of them was like, hey, look at this new story I'm working on. You want to take a stab at it? And they might share that, or they might just be sitting around the fire having drinks and discussing, well, I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and they would swap notes that way. And that's kind of more what I meant, was like it benefits you to have a somebody else who's doing that at the same level or more serious than you are, so that that A, they understand the value of not blowing smoke up your ass, and then B, they're close enough to you that you can have an honest conversation and not have people get butthurt and offended over it. And that's a rare thing. I mean, that's why you want to pay somebody.
Yeah. Keep in mind too, I'm
Because
in
it's a
Canada,
lot.
so they don't make a lot of those people at all in this country. We mostly export them to the States because they tend to be popular and famous and
Okay.
want to make
Yes.
money.
Yeah.
We get a lot of people here who are on the government tit.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and let's see, we're getting close to an hour, not quite there yet. Not that we have to quit at an hour exactly, but
My time's your time. It's all good.
in terms of story development and story editing, we look at, to break it down, we look at things like character. So typically you and I will go through and we'll talk about characters and what they ought to be doing, what they're, everything from what they ought to be doing in the story and what role they serve and whether they're going to die or not and all that kind of stuff, which is interwoven with the plot, to looking at the plot and where's the story going and what's going to take it there and what's the conflict that actually drives it. Almost like, I mean, we've never talked about this before, but it's almost like a Hegelian dialectic or something where you've got, the protagonist, the antagonist, and then, or those similar kinds of forces. And then when they clash, that produces something new. So that's where the story goes. It goes in that direction, but you're still the one who's directing it and deciding what those forces are going to be. So we look at that kind of shit. I mean, we really get pretty in depth on it when we do our story development and strategy sessions before the manuscript.
Do you want a specific example?
Sure.
This is probably my favorite one out of all of our editing sessions about strategy was the Jake Long character in Softbone. Because if you guys haven't read it yet, he starts off as like a long-housed, beaten down, ball-busting wife, a shell of a man, and he kind of ends it off in the way that you would think of as like a classic serial action guy, like the raspy voice, mystery man, the man of few words. But
he ends up as Han Solo, basically.
Yeah, Han Solo kind of thing. To get from here to there wasn't easy. And so what you had pointed out to me, that I was just kind of going through it in the way that felt natural, but it was clunky. Sometimes it rushed, sometimes it dragged. And you're like, well, look at it this way. You have this thing set up into 6 acts. So in your first 2 acts, you're establishing that he is a pansy. He's beaten down by women, very effeminate, soy boy, all that stuff, right? And you're like, and the last 2, you can have him as the archetypical hero. So then in the middle 2, have it where where in every one of those, they aren't inciting incidents, but I think what if you called them was like scenes or actions or whatever. Have it where he will do the heroic stuff, but make mistakes. So it's like 50-50. And going through that, I remember I changed, and it's just little things, right? You were like, I think that's the other thing you told me, just like maybe a line here, a line there. You don't have to make 1,000 words based on him making a single decision or something. Right. Paid off, by the way. Everybody who's talked about it's like, yeah, the character just was seamless. Like at the end, he was a completely different person, but I didn't notice when that transition happened. It just happened. I remember because then one of the solutions I had for that was right at the beginning. Everybody called him an idiot or an artard or whatever because he kept screwing things up.
Yeah.
And then he came into the second or the third act where in his head he wanted to get revenge on some guy for stealing his woman kind of thing. But he had a change of heart, realizing like, no, this guy's actually been like super nice to me, helpful and all this stuff. Like, why do I do this? He ends up I don't want to spoil it, but he ends up screwing up. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I get it. So now it's like, his natural instinct is to do the wrong thing and be the previous character. He's driven to do the right thing, but the execution, they're stumbling along the way, which really helped in the middle, which is always the hardest part I find is writing in the middle. The endings and beginnings are much easier. But then at the ending, it was great because now I don't have to think about it. I can do that one-dimensional heroic character doing heroic things because it's earned.
Yeah, because he's become, he's completed his character arc, if you want to talk about it the way, the fancy people in Hollywood. Yeah.
And it made my job easier when you brought that up too, because now I'm thinking, because at the beginning, there was a scene at the bar where he basically gets beat down, like his eyes don't work, nothing works, everything is wrong. Put him back in the bar, and all that stuff goes right. And I was like, that was like an entire chapter that wrote itself just because you kind of pointed that stuff out to me, which was amazing. Saved me a ton of work.
Well, I
Not to
think I
blow
think
smoke up your ass.
well, considering how many times you've chewed me out for complimenting you, I guess I can take it. Um, just don't get too close, okay?
Yes, sir.
But I think that's a great example of the kind of collaboration that I'm talking about. Collaboration and conversation, because because our collaboration is really just you write it, I read it, and we sit down and talk about it. Basically, I make some notes, and then we start riffing off. And we've taken, we've gone way into various directions just from doing that. Where I say, hey, what about this? And then you're like, oh man, and then you have like 15 or whatever different ideas about what you might do with that, and then you're always like, okay, well, I'll figure that out down the road. But you make a note of it, and we go on. And what I like about all of that is that one of the criticisms I see people making online about paying too much money to hire an editor or whatever is that it's like it's almost like they look at it as you're either paying too much for somebody to fix commas for you, or you're paying or you're paying a ghostwriter essentially write it for you. But that example right there is a great example of the dynamic and how this works, because I look at something and I say, hey, you got to get from this to this place. There are a lot of ways you could do that. There are a couple of ideas. And then you take that and you say, oh, what about this, this, and this? And then I say, oh yeah. And then you could also look at it like XYZ. But then, that's pretty much where it ends. And then you take that, because you're the writer, and then you figure out how, who the characters are in that, if there are any new ones, or how the character changes, or what they do, or what is said, or all that kind of shit. And
or sometimes just have to rewrite a whole chapter. That happens.
Yeah, sometimes, but that's a good example of how that collaborative process works, because I'm not really changing anything. I'm not writing it for you. I'm just looking at it and saying, I could see it going here, here, or here. And then you decide which of those things, or a lot of times we do that. And then you say, oh yeah, you could go here, 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 or here. And then you come up with something even better. And that's actually what I really like, is when you come up with something even better, because I can come up with something that makes sense for me, whose head is not in your story, because you're the one writing it, but it's close enough. It gives you enough ideas, and it's close enough that you can springboard off of that and go, oh, here's what really works there in terms of this, this world. So I think I really, to me, that's the most fun part of doing this, is when that kind of shit happens, because then I get to come back later when you're finished with it, or you're finished with the manuscript, and I get to read it. And then instead of typing, what in the comments pane, I can just type ha 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 ha, or whatever, or that's awesome, or that's great, or whatever. And I find that you get less angsty with me if I put my compliments in the comments pane instead of telling you directly. So
yeah, well, I yell at the screen, you never hear it. It's perfect.
That's right, because I'm not around for it, so I don't have to deal with the with the wah.
But yeah, I think that's the hard part for people, is coming up with. There's like two things here. Sorry, I'm going to ramble a bit. So the first, when people are worried about the price for the editor, that's fair, but I think it's because they're getting the cart ahead of the horse. Because I'm finding with the books, you could write the best book ever, but if you do no branding, nobody cares, and nobody will buy it, and nobody will read it.
Yeah.
So if you're worried about the cost of an editor, that means you probably haven't built a big enough brand where an editor wouldn't seem like a viable expense for you.
Yeah. Well, and plus, the cost of me, and I don't have anything to hide. I'll just throw it out there. Depending on the length of your story or book, for me to do a basic copy edit and also provide a little bit of line editing, which is, copy editing is fixing details like grammar and commas and punctuation and bullshit like that. Maybe a little bit of fact checking in there, here and there, if I think it needs it. And then and line editing is basically rewriting a couple sentences here or there just to make them more readable, and shit like that, which I always do. When I do that, it's always typically track changes is on, so you can go back and see what I changed and change it back if you think I got it wrong, or if you just like the way you did it the first time. And
I think
then
that's only ever happened in 2 books
yeah,
once, too,
yeah,
where I wanted to revert the change. So,
yeah. And then there's most of my other clients are just hiring me for that. They're not even really hiring me to do any story development and stuff like that. But the cost is totally based on two things. It's based on number of words I have to read and how difficult it is for me to get through them. So if if you've got if you've got 1,000 words, but your writing is so garbled and jumbled that it's very difficult to read, you're going to pay more per word than somebody who has gives me 2,000 words, but they're pretty easy to get through and there's not really any problem. So that's where part of the expense goes, and the rest of it just depends on how, again, word length and how much you actually want me to do beyond copy editing and line editing. But you're probably going to pay for a basic copy edit and line edit somewhere between 500 and 1,500 bucks, depending on word length. And then if you're doing, getting story development and stuff like that, that's really just by the hour. And, that's, it may be another, it may be another 500 bucks or 1,000 bucks, depending on what you're doing. But that's as much as you're going to pay. And 25, let's say you pay the max. So let's say it's 2,500 bucks or something for all of that shit. And you're going to balk at it. Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all, if you were going to a traditional publishing house, they're spending a lot more than 2,500 bucks to edit your book, because they're going to probably have at least 2 editors that are going to go through it, and it's going to take them a few days each, and they're going to be paid for their experience and everything else, even though you don't necessarily pay that expense up front. It comes out, they get
you'll see it on the royalty cuts.
Right. They get it on the back end, and you get it in the back end. And then the other part of it is how much, how much do you believe in your book? And the thing we always talk about and laugh about is, are you writing a bucket list book? Is this, you just want to have something, you want to have 200 pages between a cover that you can say you did and put out there, whether anybody buys it or not? Or do you want it to be the best thing it can be? And, there's some people who don't need it, and then there's other people who understand the value in that and of putting out a good product, because it's going to result ultimately in more sales, I would think.
Well, I mean, just look at it like a business. I just did 2,400. If you're just selling Kindle, not doing any graphic design, you get about $5 on Amazon. It's like 70% of $10. So you get like $7, 6, whatever. You have to sell like 400 copies.
Yeah.
So how do you know you're going to sell 400 copies? And I think when people are like, I don't know, I'll put it out there and it'll be good. Well, you're not going to sell 400 copies. You have no idea how many you're going to sell to. Meanwhile, if you have good marketing, it's like you have a funnel set up, you have an email list, you have people, like for Fuck Files, my first book you did for me, I had 1,000 people on my list. So at 1,000 people, I'm like, okay, so if half of these people buy it, it's recouped the cost. And then once it's recouped the cost, it's never going to like expire. So it'll sell as much as I'm willing to promote it. So from a business standpoint, it makes sense. And even that was just line editing in that. So you save me a month of work. And in that month, all I have to do is sell 480 copies and it pays for itself, which it did.
Right.
So I don't really balk at that cost, because it's not like, I think people treat it as if like you're taking food out of my mouth, as opposed to any other business where my inputs help me get my outputs. Either I'm buying speed or I'm buying expertise or, some value there. And I don't think people think about the time part, which is huge too. The fact that I can not quibble, because I remember my first time doing Fuck Files before I brought you on, I was doing all the editing myself. Read it, read it back to front, do all the changes here, do all this stuff, spend an inordinate amount of time on it. And then you're like, I tell you what, like, because I'm like, screw this, I'm gonna hire an editor. I hired some guy, got catfished by English as a second language type, And then you looked at it's like, dude, here, I tell you what. And you just threw a number at me. He's like, if you do this, I can clean it up. I'm like, oh, thank God. I just threw the money at you. At that point, it was just damage control. But the damage control was the difference because those first 50 people that bought it were good friends of mine. So they like, this is bad. So I'm like, all right, I could fix that. But if random people who didn't know me were only reading that first garbage version, it wouldn't have sold its 480 needed copies to recoup the costs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I could
And
have
plus,
saved the money that I would have spent on you as an editor, but I wouldn't have made any money anyway. And the
yeah,
problem with that is the people that like that one might like another one. So I'm losing not just a sale from a customer on a book, but I'm losing potentially 6 sales from 6 customers on 6 books.
right.
It's very
And
short-sighted.
well, and the other thing is that a lot of people that balk at that number, and really the average number ends up being, since most people just want um, copy editing and line editing, that number ends up depending on word count, that number ends up, they'll probably spend somewhere between 1,100 and 1,300 with me, but that takes care of a lot of stuff they don't have to worry about. And I think that's the other value there is that, you're handing that off to me at some point to be sort of not necessarily the final, but pretty much the main bridge between you and the readers themselves in terms of interacting with your text. So you can focus 100% of your time on the story, which is what's most important. And then, hire me to come in and just, bring it all in focus a little bit. And that cuts down on the amount of writing time you have. And it also helps you not be distracted from the main thing, which is focusing on the story itself. And so I think there's a lot of value there, but it really depends on how people view their project and what they're doing and whether, what they want to accomplish with it. And these days in particular, I can see why people don't see a lot of value there because nobody really takes their writing seriously anymore anyway. But the people who sell, even if you don't like Stephen King and you don't like any of the really big bestsellers in the marketplace, they spend way more than $2,500 or $1,500 or $1,000 on having their manuscript looked at and cleaned up and tightened up and all that kind of stuff. So it,
Well, yeah, and
to me,
we're
it's
not buying produce. Like I said, it's not. Stephen King writes it. When did he write it? Early 80s? Something like that? Mid 80s? Like and if he would have just been like, oh, I don't want to pay that extra for this. I just want to get it out there and get those first sales. If he didn't do that, screenwriter wouldn't have picked up, make a movie. People are still buying it today. Like there's a permanence to it. And I get the whole, I want to get this out on the cheap, minimum viable product, tech bro attitude. I'll fix it in the bug fixings, which, you can do. Amazon has a feature where if your book sucks, people will say this specifically is spelt wrong. And it'll tell you up to like 150 mistakes. Hey, fix all this stuff. And if you don't, it actually takes it off the market. You can go that route if you want to and treat your audience as quality control. It's cheaper, but I don't want to take that business risk. But again,
think about doing that
seriously.
I mean, if you do that, and I think there's some legitimacy to that. Although having worked, my main gig for the past 20 years was as a software guy, and even releasing a minimum viable product, it still got to work. There's going to be bugs in there, but it still got to overall, be a proof of concept and be functional. And then you can go back, especially with things being on the web. It's easy to do patches and bug fixes. But again, there's an opportunity cost there because the more time you're spending once it's out there trying to fix things and do damage control and not hinder your reputation, that's time you don't have to spend working on new features and new benefits and expanding this and doing that. And if you're in a startup, generally the manpower is short, at the beginning. So you don't have a team of developers to be working on new features and a whole team to be working on bug fixes and server issues. You generally have a lot of people who wear a lot of hats, and that really ends up, that can impact your velocity going forward. So it's really important to try to get something good out there to begin with. And then the other thing is, to use your example, If it were, I mean, $2,500 or $1,500 or whatever is what, startups spend more than that on t-shirts and swag. I mean, it's like, and if you hire an editor like me or Kristen or Kirsten, is it Kristen or
Yeah.
Kirsten?
Kristen.
Kristen, right?
I know I get it mixed up all the time
Kristen,
myself.
yeah.
Is the R before or after the I?
Yeah. But either way, if you hire someone like that, they're going to not only improve your product way more, well, much faster than you're going to be able to, and will help you get it out in the marketplace quicker at a better quality and let you start working on the next book rather than dealing with ramifications from this one.
Because you're paying the other way too. You're just paying in reader goodwill.
Right.
I don't know how much that's worth, but I don't like spending that if I don't have to.
No, exactly. No, that's exactly right. That's why I look at it anyway. So I think there's a lot.
Like software. That's the thing too. Software, that's something new. Whatever somebody puts out a software piece, it's something new. Books, it's like a competitive monopoly. People can pick up a different book in whatever genre you could write. Yeah. I don't like this crap. I don't like Softbone. I'm going to go read Gibson again.
Well, and the faster you get, a decent manuscript done and ready to put out there in the market, you can, the faster, because you have to have that done before you can do the audiobook. So the faster you can get your audiobook narrated and done, if you're doing one of those, which you should be doing, because that's probably, I'm guessing that's probably half of all sales or something like that for most people.
Dude, you're not going to like this. 60% of all my sales are audiobooks of the book.
I mean, that's, good. I mean, that's just, it's the same work, right?
Oh yeah. Some people get mad and I'm like, well, I just think of it like a business. All right. I like your book, but I don't want to read it. All right. You can pay me to read it to you.
Right.
Deal. Like, fair. Right. Like, who am I to tell you how to enjoy my stuff? Who the fuck am I?
Well, I mean, back in the day, when there was a time in my life when I had an hour commute both ways to my office. And so I'd listen to, books that I didn't really think, books that I wasn't listening to for enjoyment as much as information. I would get the audio book and listen to a lot of nonfiction back and forth in my car. Mm-hmm. And then when I was at home at night after the kids went to bed, I'd sit there for an hour or 2 hours and actually, drag my eyes across a bunch of words on a page. And I would read, a novel or something that I was reading for other reasons. And so, it's like there's a place for everything. And it's nice to be able to listen to audiobooks while you're working during the day on something else that you don't really have to be too engaged. I mean, I used to listen to audiobooks all the time when I was a code monkey writing code all day. And, I'd alternate between that and music depending on my mood or the project, but whatever. Anyway.
But on story,
I won't keep you any longer.
Because if I'm just rambling on the page, try to read that. Have you ever tried to read rambling mess? It's not easy.
Oh yeah.
So I think that's another thing. If you really want a good sales pitch in it when you're eventually doing your audiobook, if your story's not coherent, the guy who has to read the effing thing is going to hate his life, and it's going to take him forever because they make mistakes. The easier a story is to read, the easier it is to say out loud as well, which is something I found out the hard way.
Yeah. No, you're definitely right. And there's, and I'll add an anecdote about that. A guy who wrote a really good nonfiction book this year, or finished it this year, who I helped with the editing, and also I engineered the audio book. He and I were talking during the time because he would read a chapter into his microphone, and then he'd send the file to me when he was done, and I would master it. And we got to talking, and he was talking about, okay, so I finished this, but I'm going to rewrite this passage, and I'll send you that as kind of a patch later. I looked at it kind of like a software patch, because he didn't like the way it read. It just felt too clunky when he read it out loud. So he would rewrite it, and he would send me that. And so that I would just go find that section in the chapter he'd already sent after I'd mastered it. And then I would master the patch and then insert that in so that he didn't have to reread the whole chapter or whatever. So we would do stuff like that. But he was doing that all the time. He's like, I just don't I don't like the way this sounds when I read it out loud, even though it's okay on the printed page.
Yeah, it's understandable. It's like a flow or a just sounds off.
Yeah. So, and it's just kind of, it can be clunky with your tongue if it's, if there's a lot of words that begin with B or something like that, it's like you don't really notice it when you're reading it, but when you try to say it out loud, it ends up sounding funny, or you stumble over your tongue or something. So there was a lot of that in that particular project. But anyway,
yeah. So
keep you more.
From what I remember, if you're hiring voice actors, they are not cheap. So if you can pay your editor $2,000 to make it easy to read through, and you save yourself 2 hours of recording time, it's like you're making money off of this.
Yeah, I think there's some benefit to that as well. Yeah,
especially. But again, people think short term. They're like, oh, cost in front, no cost. Like there's some kind of Middle Eastern souk dealer haggling over fake watches.
Right, right. Yeah, that's kind of funny. They don't really take all of the. I don't think they really understand what goes into making a quality manuscript that somebody can read and be done with it and just be like, and that was a great story. That was a great story, except, I couldn't read these chapters too well because everything was all fucked up. It's kind of like that. And I think that's the thing that's missing on a lot of people's thinking when they're independent writers, is that my goal I think the thinking is they're kind of engineering themselves to fail. This isn't going to sell anything anyway, so I don't want to be out any money on it. And I think that's kind of an ass backwards way of looking at it. But hey, I'm still the guy who's out there.
If it goes wrong, I could have done it better. I decided to save some money. That's why it didn't sell. It's not because I tried my best and it wasn't good enough.
Right.
That's my thought on it. It's like, it's okay. Well, you're allowed. People are gonna think you're a piece of shit, even if you're great.
And I got
the greatest writer of the '80s. People still think he's a piece of shit, and he's kind of earned it, but he doesn't care.
Well, and another thing is that those prices, my rates that I announced that's pretty fucking cheap, even for good independent editors, freelance editors. That's pretty fucking cheap. And the reason it's fucking cheap is I don't need the money. I just want my time compensated for, and B, I mainly only work with people who I like working with. So,
I do remember you saying that. Yeah, it's like there's people, if you don't like their book, you charge it so that way to make it worth your time for them to take you on as an editor. It's really nice to have an editor that's willing to fire a client if he needs to.
Well, I've lost a lot of work that way, but I've also, I've worked 30 years already in 2 other different verticals. I'm doing this because I really love engaging with people who write. So I really like being a part of that, even though I don't want to do it full time, but it's fun to be able to work with people who are enthusiastic about what they're doing. Well, it's just fun that, it's from a project standpoint. I'm a project guy because that's what software was. It's always, one project to the next. And books are exactly like that. Even if you work with the same person, it's a different project each time. And it's just fun. I like being a part of that process. And, but I don't want to do it, 100 hours a day. I just want to do it when it's fun to do, for the most part, or when I think I can really help somebody and they really appreciate that. And that's good too. So anyway,
it's good. Honestly, for the love of the game, I think more people need to do this for the love of the game, as opposed to the identity or the bucket list or I know some people make their book to be merch, which I think is lazy as shit. Yeah, they like my YouTube channel. They'll love the book. I don't want to say who, but there's one YouTube guy that's in my kind of space. It's essentially like a Dr. Seuss book, except for without the rhymes.
Right.
He's charging full price for it. I'm thinking, it get me so insecure. I'm thinking, am I doing too much work? One of those ones. What's wrong with me? That's how bad it was. I don't like that.
Well, it's well, Well, I think we've gone on about this long enough. I appreciate you coming
All
on
right.
again and doing this, 'cause I really enjoy talking about it, and hope that helps somebody out there, whether they're writing or they're editing or thinking about doing either one.
Considering the audience.
There's a good the best situation is where you have a good collaborative process, and I think that I've worked, because I worked in software for such a long time, there's a lot of collaboration that goes on there, and sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. But when it works really well, it's a lot of fun. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I've always enjoyed working with you, is because we it seems like it's always productive. We always have a good time doing it, and it doesn't really feel too much like work. So
Yeah.
that's always the perfect storm I like to be in anyway.
Works for me.
Yeah. Any new developments on anything you want to shout out to the 5 people watching?
Oh, Softbone 2's in the works. Nick and I were just talking about it. It's going to be great. Like every other sequel, they're going to go back in time to the 1980s. Okay,
That's
only
awesome.
fans of like Star Trek get that joke. That's fine. Nick's like, whatever.
Yeah.
It's interesting to a sequel. I've never done a sequel before, and I can see why a lot of people don't like sequels. It's restricting and not in a good way, but it's actually kind of fun. I think you'll like how I've taken it. I think Nick's already seen. I've made the one. I don't want to spoil anything, so I just push it. But yeah, guys, get in on the newsletter. You'll love it there. I put one character in there that was like, anybody who was trying to appeal to the people who liked Softbone would probably hate that I did it, which is kind of why I did it. You'll see when it happens. That's all I got.
All right. Well, until next time, thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you when we see you.